Well, welcome to a special event we're calling No Hug Sunday. I'd like for it to be Fist Bump Sunday, but that's too close. It's called contact. So we're going to make it Elbow Bump Sunday, okay? All right, I've already had a few of those today. It's not a foul unless you do it too hard. Then that would be a foul, I suppose. We actually had a pretty good crowd first service. I don't know how many there's in here right now. I'm going to say about 200, and y'all know how good I am at counting crowds. Maybe 210. But there's about 140 here this morning, so that's actually pretty good. We've got a lot of folks that obviously we would kind of prefer that they stay in for safety, and so don't want to have anyone here that doesn't need to be here. At the same time, appreciate the efforts, and as Alan mentioned, a lot of efforts are being made to keep you as safe while you're here as you can be. They're disinfecting all the time. After the crowd got in here, they had disinfected all the door handles again. The pulpit got disinfected between services. I'm not sure if I'm encouraged by that or of course I always have known I'm my own worst enemy, right? But now that Daniel Hudson's been up here, maybe we ought to do it again. But the reason why, obviously we're at 9 and 10 today because that's our normal time to be here, and that way no matter when you arrive, there's a worship service. The reason for the shift for next Sunday being 8 and 10 is that 8 o'clock will separate the crowds. That way we won't be coming in and out at the same time and be quite a crowd together. So that'll separate us into two small crowds. And so for the time being, our encouragement is obviously to not have crowds over 250. And so that's what we're accomplishing this way. And we'll see what the time brings. And we'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. Let me give you just a couple of announcements. I won't give you any event announcements because, as Alan said, we don't know what events will be. Ladies' Day is kind of a debate, and it will be debated for later, and there's plenty of time for that. Events for the month, other than our worship service, is basically all canceled for safety precautions. I want you to be prayerful today for Joanne Evett. She has been at Conway Regional after suffering a fall. She'll be headed to rehab for a few days. Charles Mosier, who has been diagnosed with bone cancer, and treatment plan for him is in the works right now. Lois Carlin, not doing well. She is now in Heritage. She's been moved there, so keep her in your prayers. You've been praying this week for Rachel Copeland, who lost her grandfather this week. I hope you're encouraged by being here together with us today. I know they've had a difficult week, but at the same time, you bring up all the memories and you do a lot of reflecting in those times. And we're glad we serve the God who is the God of all comfort and the God who understands very well that this world He made is not what it's all about. It's the world He's got prepared for us. You also are aware that Charles Wade passed away on Tuesday. Graveside service for him will be this coming Tuesday afternoon in just outside of Russellville. If you saw John Ayers, hope you congratulated him. Oakley, Corinne Ayers, born on Tuesday of this week. They are doing well, and so we congratulate them. If you will, turn with me to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16. We're talking about expectations and experience. And we're going to have, we talked about Jesus and the Messiah expectation last week. We're going to talk a little bit about the expectations during His ministry. And we're going to bring Him back into this series a time or two over the next several weeks. But I want you to zero in with me on Matthew chapter 16 as we think about the expectations that they had for Jesus, the expectations that got changed as the disciples learned who He was. And I'll start with this. At this point, they understand that Jesus was not ordinary. They're way past that at this point. And even the people that they're speaking about here in chapter 16 understand that as well. Jesus is calling on his disciples to reflect and to summarize their experience to this point. Now, Jesus has fed the 5,000. Jesus has fed the 4,000. Jesus has walked on water in the presence of his disciples. Jesus has healed sick folks on several occasions in the midst of his disciples. So his disciples have seen an awful lot at this point. As chapter 16 begins, the Pharisees and the Sadducees come to him and want a sign from heaven. And he basically says, he talks about some signs of the season and of weather, and then he turns around and says that there's going to be no sign given you except the sign of Jonah. Now, some folks debate what the sign of Jonah is, but the easiest explanation for the sign of Jonah is that Jonah was in the belly of the whale, and then he was coming back out. Jesus is going to be in the belly of the earth, and he's going to be resurrected on the third day. And so that probably is the easiest explanation for the sign of Jonah. And he basically says the sign that will be given you is what's going to happen to me. And then his disciples, they reached the other side. They'd forgotten to bring bread. They'd forgotten to bring bread. We don't often forget to bring bread, or we don't forget to buy bread. I'm sure some of you are thinking last week, you wish you hadn't forgotten to buy toilet paper. I've been gone for 5 days. There's none available. But I understand my good friend Charles Harris is selling paper to his friends for $5 a roll, saying we've got to take care of one another. But anyway, I'm sure he'll give me a discount, like $4.98, something like that. But they're all upset because they haven't brought bread. Well, this thing's not about bread, and it's going to take them a while to understand this. He makes the statement to them in verse 8, "O you of little faith, why is it that you're discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive? Do you not remember?" He says, "How many loaves and baskets you took up of the loaves and the fishes when I fed the 5,000? How many baskets full did you take up when I fed the 4,000? And then he ends by saying, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Now, Mark's rendition of this is a little bit more intriguing, because in Mark's rendition of this, he has the disciples answering the questions. When you fed the 5,000, how many baskets full did you take up? What's the answer? 5,000. 12. Everybody goes, 12. I think 12. Yes, 12. When he fed the 4,000, how many baskets did you take up? 7. And in Mark's account, he gives the disciples answering it. And I'm sure it's not Peter saying, ooh, 7. No, they're embarrassed by it. Because he said, when I fed the 5,000, how many full baskets did you take up after that was all done? 12. Feeding the 4,000, how many baskets did you take up after it was done? 7. O you of little faith. Now, when he says beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, what's the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Verse 12 says, "Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." You see, the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees were preventing them from seeing the truth of Jesus. They were downplaying who he was. They're trying to silence what's really happening. They're trying to explain away the great things that he's doing. I think for us, the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees is the fact that Satan has this ability, and it's one of his greatest tools, in that he blinds us to seeing Jesus for who he really is, because he throws other things in front of us. He throws other things in front of us. He throws objections in front of us, and he keeps us from seeing, and he blinds our eyes to see who he really is. And that's basically what Jesus is saying to his disciples here in Matthew chapter 16. You've not truly yet seen who I am. And then in verse 13, they come into the district of Caesarea Philippi, and he asked them, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" Now notice when he gives that description of himself, he says Son of Man. Son of Man is the most humble distinction, tag that Jesus is ever assigned with, and it's the one he uses for himself. He could have claimed to be Son of God. He could have claimed to be the Christ. He could have claimed to be the Messiah, but he says Son of Man. He wants them to see the other. And so he's saying, who do they say that the Son of Man is? See, Son of Man just basically means son born of a man, human being. I'm a human being. But we know the implication that his own use of that phrase is prophetic. His own use of that phrase means that there's more to it than that. They understand that he's not ordinary. They understand that too well. But they've been blinded, as the world had, and as the world still is, by what Jesus calls the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There's a push here to relegate Jesus and to categorize Jesus as a prophet. Jesus is asking what they're hearing about him and about his identity. They answer in verse 14 when he says, who do people say the Son of Man is? Some say, notice the listing, John the Baptist. Others say Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. 4 distinctions. 3 distinctions and then a broader category, if you will. And we might ask, why is that the reputation? Now, some people make a play on this, and I'm not sure how much emphasis to put here, that no one, he's not claiming that anyone says that he's the Messiah. They don't believe he's the Messiah. They haven't seen that. Now, the disciples are coming to that conclusion, but the other folks have not. They say he's John the Baptist. Why John the Baptist? Well, if you'll think back, Herod, before this time, Herod is already getting paranoid because he killed John the Baptist. Now he's hearing of the miracles Jesus is doing, and he himself says to the folks around him, this is John the Baptist come back from the dead. So the John the Baptist thing is, this is John the Baptist come back from the dead. Not that he actually is John the Baptist, but probably the John the Baptist come back from the dead theory that's going around at this point in time. Some saying you're John the Baptist. Others Elijah. Why Elijah? Why would they think he's Elijah? Well, a very simple reason for that one too. The next to the last verse in the Old Testament, the last name the last name mentioned in the Old Testament. Next to the last verse, Malachi chapter 4, verse 5, there is Elijah coming. Elijah is going to come before the great day of the Lord. Elijah is going to come first. And so they're thinking somebody great is coming. They're impressed with what Jesus can do. He must be Elijah come back. Although Jesus himself, if you'll remember, doesn't suggest that he's the Elijah. He suggests that John the Baptist is the Elijah, and John the Baptist is pointing obviously toward him and toward his coming. And so Jesus himself will attribute the John the Baptist, or Elijah rather, to being John the Baptist. So that kind of takes care of some saying you're John the Baptist or others saying you're Elijah. Why Jeremiah? Well, it would seem that the reason why Jeremiah gets on this list is probably simply because he's considered the greatest prophet, especially to the people that he's dealing with here. Jeremiah was the last one to prophesy to Jerusalem. He's the last one to prophesy to the nation of Judah before the nation is carted off into captivity. Now, there are major prophets in the captivity time, Ezekiel and Daniel. Isaiah was a good 100 or so years prior to this, or prior to Jeremiah. And then the prophets after that are the minor prophets talking about the restoration and the redemption and the remnant and all those sort of things. So Jeremiah is definitely one of the greatest of the prophets. And when you read the prophecy, Jeremiah is the one that kind of stands above the rest of them in so many ways. So Jeremiah makes sense. And then they say John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah are one of the prophets, and that maybe is the greater key. You know, and he's just saying, well, they've got all kinds of guesses on which prophet you are. But the point is probably made in that fourth distinction, one of the prophets. Because you see, the push is to categorize Jesus as a prophet. As a prophet, he's got power. As a prophet, you understand, he's got great words. As a prophet, you understand that he's significant, but he's a prophet. A prophet. Many of you have been to Guyana. In the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, I went to Guyana probably about 13 times. A group of us went and we would preach in campaigns and establish churches on the west bank of the Demerara River. We were in a little town some of you may have been to. You cross the Demerara, you go down to the T, a couple of miles down the road, and you go left. And about 6 miles down that road is the little town of Wales. Worked a lot of time with a guy by the name of Desmond Zephyr. Desmond Zephyr, an old preacher in Wales for years and years and years. But anyway, one of the trips we were on, we were doing a campaign. We were preaching in the evenings, you know, and we had an old tent out on the bank of the Demerara River. Well, you'd have the seawall, the big levee, and then you'd have a level spot, and then you'd have the riverbank. And so we were on that spot between the levee and the river, and we're preaching every night. And something happened one night. That's what I'm getting to. Something happened one night that is a memory of mine, just as though it were yesterday. And it's just it just spoke to me so significantly. Our process would be is on the night that we weren't preaching, because we were rotating the preaching. One of us would be up on the seawall, up on the levee on this end of the tent. Another one would be on the levee on the other end of the tent, kind of watching to make sure things are okay. No one's planning on coming and robbing us all. No one's causing any big commotion. You're just a little bit of a security guard and everything else, and a greeter and all those sort of things all wrapped up into one. Well, anyway, one night during the assembly, there's this one guy just walking the levee. And I was keeping an eye on him because I wasn't too sure, if everything was okay. But he slowly walked that levee. So for about a minute or two, he heard the preaching, because you were hearing the preaching because it was pretty loud down there. And he was hearing it. And when I greeted him when he came by and he didn't respond to me, and he no sooner got by me than he said something I'll never forget. I would love to say it just like he said it in his same, his same way of saying it. I probably could do it, but my family says I'm terrible at voices. So I'm not going to do it, although I could do it and it would be great, I'm sure. The truth is, I'm not going to do it because I know I'm terrible at it. It would sound, you would like thinking, this guy's not from Australia, though. But literally, the words stuck with me and are there as a memory as though it were yesterday. He didn't get much past me, and he said it loud enough where I could hear it. He said it loud enough where he was hoping everybody down there could hear it, because as he walked by, without turning around, he simply said, Jesus was only a prophet. Jesus was only a prophet. You see, if you can relegate Jesus to prophet status, you've pulled him down. If you relegate Jesus to prophet status, then he's a great man, but he's not the greatest of men. If you can relegate Jesus to prophet status, then you can give him credit for doing some good things, but you don't have to fall down and worship him because he's only a prophet. Jesus was only a prophet, he said. But the reality is, we know better than that. We understand better than that. Because the reality is, and we'll sort of draw to a close on this one, Jesus was the expected one, the Messiah, right? Jesus was the expected one, but he was not the one they expected. He was not the one they expected. The disciples' own expectations of Jesus are changing on a daily basis. He turns as they say that, and he says, but who do you say I am? Yes, it was Peter. Peter speaks up and gives the great confession, as we call it sometimes. This confession was so significant, and it was so right on point that Jesus gives a blessing to Peter. He pronounces a blessing on Peter for having said it out loud. What does Peter say? We know the words. Peter says, you are the Christ. But who do you say I am? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that second part is the more significant. You see, the disciples are understanding that he is the Messiah, right? You are the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one. But he's saying more than that. He's saying, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Because he understands, and the disciples understand, Jesus to be the very Son of God. God on earth. And that puts him in a whole different category. This marks a change in the teaching of Jesus. After these words of Jesus, verse 20 says, then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. It's not time yet. Now they have a secret that they're not supposed to be revealing. Don't tell everybody that he is the Christ. And then verse 21, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. He starts teaching them about his own crucifixion, because that's what the Great One came to do. Jesus is the one around whom this whole day has centered for nearly 2,000 years. We come together every Sunday, not because it's the day that's got the least events happening. We come together because it's been a day that's been dedicated for 2,000 plus years now as a memorial for the day of the resurrection, because it was on a Sunday morning that Jesus was resurrected. And the disciples came together that day, and the disciples came together on the 8th day, which was 1 week later, and they gathered together to memorialize that, and that began the practice of the early church. As I said earlier, we're going to do everything we can to keep you as safe as you can be when you come here. We're going to do what we can to keep the crowds down for our social distancing, which, yes, we need to do. But we're going to come together in some form or fashion to worship our God on the Lord's Day, because that's what Christians do. As we've suggested, and some of those even listening at home today, we're going to make sure that the people at home have communion, so that as we take communion here, they can take communion with us. And if things get worse, and we're forbidden to assemble at all, then we will have a virtual assembly is what we will do, some form of it. It may be me preaching in this spot to a completely different audience, and every one of you be listening online in some form or fashion. It may be a couple of other ministers and elders rotating through this spot in front of a camera so that we can all have a virtual worship service. But we will be doing whatever we can be doing to acknowledge that this is the day that Christians worship our God. Last couple of days it's been, they canceled the SEC tournament. Well, you might as well just cancel the NCAA tournament, which they did. Well, if they cancel ball games, why don't we cancel church? Answer to that simply, folks, is that church is more important than a ball game. There's the true answer. More important than a ball game. And we need to know, and we need to teach our kids that worshiping God and honoring our God who saved us is more important than any other event we do. So it may be getting more assemblies to keep the crowd smaller. It may be a virtual assembly, but it will be something, because we will honor our God on the Lord's day. And however that needs to be, that will be fine. If it's listening rather than being here in person, then that will be fine. Because Jesus is not a prophet. Peter was right. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And He gave His life for us. And the most important thing in our life is to make our life look like His. And to show the gratitude that we have in our hearts, that swells up in our hearts for what He has done for us. As we stand and sing this song of encouragement, if there are ways in which we can go to God on your behalf, if we can pray with you, if we can serve you in any way, let us know your need as we sing together, please.